The dogs barked when the soldiers came to Nob, but the sound disappeared under the clatter of hooves and the metallic hiss of unsheathed blades. The first door went down with a crack. A baby cried. Someone shouted for the priest. Doeg the Edomite rode at the center of the line, face set, eyes fixed on the tabernacle tents behind the cluster of homes, where smoke from the altar still drifted to the pale morning sky. "By the king's command," he said, and the men fanned out. When the killing started, men, then women, then boys and girls, the shouting turned to a steady, brutal rhythm. The herd animals scattered, bleeding, until riders cut them down too, and the cries mixed with the human ones. The town had no walls. It had a sanctuary. That did not stop swords. 2 days earlier, the path to this horror began quietly. David, son of Jesse, had already run from Saul's court. The king's jealousy had curdled into open violence, spears thrown at dinner, soldiers sent in the dark. On the road out of Gibeah, David angled south toward Nob, where priests from the line of Eli served at the sanctuary while the ark remained elsewhere. He arrived hungry, unarmed, and alone, but for a few men nearby. Ahimelech the priest came out, unsettled to see a royal servant without an escort. David told him he was on urgent business for the king, cover that spared the old man from an impossible choice, and asked for bread. Ahimelech had only holy loaves set before the Lord and replaced that day. After questions to satisfy the law, he gave David the bread and, at David's request, a weapon, Goliath's sword, wrapped and stored behind the ephod, a trophy from a field outside the Elah Valley. There was one more pair of eyes at Nob that morning. A shepherd and official in Saul's service, Doeg the Edomite, sat, detained before the Lord. He watched David receive bread and the giant's sword. He heard enough to make a story. Back at Gibeah, Saul's fear wore the shape of certainty. David, he insisted, conspired against him. Jonathan, his own son, had sided with the rival. Officers stood in a half-circle as the king demanded loyalty and proof. When nobody spoke, Doeg stepped forward and gave the tale he knew would land hard. He had seen David at Nob, seen the priest give him provisions, seen him receive a weapon. He left out the hunger, the cover story, the priest's questions. He presented it as aid to a rebel. Saul sent for Ahimelech and the priests. They came in their linen garments, a sight that should have calmed a king. It did not. "Why have you conspired against me?" Saul asked. Ahimelech answered simply. David was the king's son-in-law, a faithful officer, a man he had inquired for many times with the ephod. If David now ran, the priest hadn't known it. He had given bread to a servant of the crown. The speech was honest. It was also useless. Saul pronounced sentence. The guards, hearing the order to kill priests of the Lord, froze. Not one lifted a sword. Doeg did. He stepped forward when the Israelites would not, and he cut down the men in their linen, 85 of them by the ledger the chronicler would later keep. Then he rode for Nob itself and finished the order with terrifying obedience, men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. The town's small sounds, millstones, goat bells, morning talk, went quiet under a sheet of violence that did not distinguish a faithful priest from a startled child. Fires caught on straw. Smoke climbed. When the soldiers pulled back, the sanctuary that had fed David lay in ruin, and Doeg had carried out the king's rage more completely than the king had dared to imagine. One man slipped out of the tide. Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, ran from Nob and found his way to David. He tore his clothes and told the story in broken bursts, the summons to Gibeah, the accusation, the refusal of the guards, Doeg stepping in, the slaughter, the last looks on faces he'd known since childhood. David listened and felt the blame hit like a stone. "I knew on that day," he told Abiathar, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, "I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house." It was a sentence heavy with guilt and with the awful math of cause and effect. David gave the only protection he could. "Stay with me. The one who seeks my life seeks yours also. With me, you will be safe." News of Nob spread in every direction. In Israelite towns, people heard that a king, once anointed and promising, had turned his hand against priests. In Philistine cities, men who remembered their own fallen champion heard that Goliath's sword had resolved back into David's grip. In the hills, families of the slain sat in dust, and the usual rituals, wash, bury, sing, fell apart because there were too many bodies and too much fear. Doeg's name became a sentence of its own. People said it with a tight mouth. David reached for the one weapon he still had when hunted and powerless: a song. The words we have carry the title, "When Doeg the Edomite Came and Told Saul." It begins not with the priestly dead, but with the instrument of their death. "Why do you boast of evil, mighty man?" he wrote. "Your tongue plots destruction, like a sharp razor." The lines cut back at the cutter. They accuse the act and the man, and grant no excuse. They also defer punishment away from the hunted singer's hand. "God will break you down forever," the song insists. "He will snatch and tear you from your tent." It is what powerless people do when human courtrooms are closed to them. They put their case into the only court they believe still works. Doeg did not disappear into quiet service. A man willing to do what frightened other soldiers would always find errands in a court, fed by fear. Yet the story does not record his later victories or a peaceful old age. The sacred history pivots away from him toward a different arc: a fugitive gathering the discontented, a king doubling down on violence, a meeting in a cave where mercy restrained a blade, a father-in-law who saw his rival's face and wept. Doeg returns only as a shadow in a psalm, the embodiment of a kind of loyalty that empties a person of fear and replaces it with iron. Traditions outside the main text try to finish his story. They say learning left him before life did, that his knowledge, wide as a sea, dried up to a puddle and then cracked. They say he met a violent end. But the canonical chronicle leaves him at Nob, sword lifted, a name attached to a day when a holy town died because it fed a hungry man and handed him a weapon wrapped in cloth. In one sense, the lack of a recorded human execution is the point. The only death sentence that survives in writing for Doeg is sung, not stamped. It waits in the trust that judgment exists beyond the reach of a hired hand. For David, the cost of that day never vanished. Even when he wore a crown, he kept Abiathar close, a living reminder that the throne he eventually took had been built over the ashes of a sanctuary. When Abiathar later stumbled and backed the wrong claimant, the old wounds surfaced in the order that sent him away. "Go back to your fields," the king told him years later, "for you carried the ark of the Lord before me and shared in all my affliction." Mercy, then distance. Those were the tools David used with a priest who had watched a town burn because David once lied to its elder out of fear. The deeper lesson of Nob ran through every chapter that followed. Kings do not merely aim armies, they shape what kind of courage their servants practice. Saul taught his court to equate obedience with righteousness, to believe that the label enemy on arrival absolved any order that followed. In that space, Doeg flourished. When other men hesitated, he stepped forward with a simple rule: the king speaks, and the edge answers. In the glare of that rule, priests and infants and animals all looked like the same target. The day the soldiers rode away, Nob stood as proof that a nation can turn its weapons inward and call the act justice. Smoke drifted over the hills. Crows circled. The altar stones were damp. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a shepherd found a scorched scrap of linen tangled in thorn and did not touch it. Far away, a singer recited a psalm that condemned a mouth sharpened like a blade and promised that arrogance ends. History kept the names it needed: David, Saul, Abiathar. It kept Doeg's name too, not to celebrate a victory, but to remember a choice. We do not have the scene where he paid. We have the scene where he chose, and the echo of a song that says, choices carry their own sentence, sometimes later than we want, and in a court we do not see. Nob was a small town, not a fortress. It fell in an hour. Its story refuses to. Thank you for listening to Divine Crime. Subscribe for more true stories from the most dangerous book ever written.